Well, hello everyone. This is Mark Tinsley, and you're joining us on Clean Slate, where we talk about the real issues of the church with real people through real talk. And we're going to start that right now. Once again, folks, welcome to Clean Slate. I'm your host, Mark Tinsley. And what we do on Clean Slate here is we attack the misconceptions, the inconsistencies, the problems, and really the wackiness that we find in the church. And we do this not simply to highlight these things, but also to give our viewers tools that they can use to fix or handle effectively the problems, the misconceptions, the inconsistencies, so they can be the followers of Christ that He's created them to be. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Christian higher education. Now, intuition would dictate that if you mix academia, higher education, with Christianity, if you put together the best of critical thought and learning and faith, that what you should get is something that's extraordinarily good. But that's not what happens all of the time. In so many cases, now certainly not all cases, but in so many cases, what we get is something that's not only regrettable, but also something that is far less than God's ideal. Well, today our guest is Dr. Emily Hitty. Emily is the Senior Director of Student Success and Retention at Longwood University, and she's also a former upper administrator in Christian higher education. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Well, as you know, we start off the first segment in this show with what we call the gut. What's your gut reaction when you hear the term Christian higher education?
Wow. I have a complicated gut reaction to that. And I think what that means is that I think there's multiple definitions, multiple ways to understand it. And we need to be clear on what we mean in order to have a productive conversation about it. So just off the top of my head, I'd say there's a sort of Christian higher education where you have faith infused into what's essentially mainstream education. It's regular education and faith. And a school like somewhere like Notre Dame strikes me as a place like that, where you're going to get some theological training, but that's not the core of what you're doing. The conduct codes aren't extremely different than what you're going to see at your average state university, so on and so forth. On the far other end of the spectrum, you have something that's sort of like what happens when a church tries to become a college. And that can be very effective. People can get very good educations at places like, for example, Bob Jones. But what you're doing there is something more like a church camp experience with learning layered on top of faith, rather than vice versa. I'd like us to think about being smarter about what true integration looks like, though I'm not saying we're going to infuse faith in learning or we're going to infuse learning in faith, but rather to say, how do we learn with faith as the foundation under it? I would go back to thinkers like John Henry Newman, who sort of founded or at least expressed first our idea of the liberal arts university, right? The idea that we're seeking truth and we're seeking it from many angles in a diversity of ways, but it's truth. And faith, religion, all of those things are objects of knowledge just as much as chemistry or physics or something else is. So we use the same critical lenses to look at all of it. And in doing that, we firm up our faith and we learn better.
Right. So it's not, you don't approach it with an agenda. We're going to force feed faith into the Christian. It just becomes a part of what we're doing in the educational process.
Absolutely. And faith is a way of knowing. And I think any of us who've been on our own faith journey know the world looks different as we deepen in faith. Right. And why would we decide that's anti-intellectual? I'd say it's a richer sort of intellectualism. And exploring that using the tools of higher education deepens us in our faith.
Right. Well, I think having that basis and that foundation of understanding what Christian higher education is important before we ask the first question, because we're looking at the problem of culture.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people would agree that there's dysfunction in Christian higher education right now. You spend any amount of time on some of these Christian higher education campuses, certainly if you look at the media and the news, it's clear that there's problems out there. Now, naturally, there are some schools that are doing good work. We want to make that very clear tonight.
Absolutely.
That there are some schools out there that are doing some wonderful work, living by good value systems, principles of faith, and really knocking it out of the park. But the number of high-profile Christian schools that are out there that find themselves, like I say, on the wrong side of the media, it's pretty substantial.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are some types and examples of dysfunction that are found in Christian higher education?
I'm on a state university campus now, so I think the example that's the most present in my everyday life right now is Baylor. And I think we all know about the Title IX situations, the athletics abuses at Baylor. And I think Baylor's on a real road to repentance. They're trying to recover, but it's going to be a long process with a lot of deep apologies that they're going to have to go through. And what happened at Baylor is that they made an idol out of football.
Right.
And I think it's the same sort of thing that you'll see at, for example, the Chronicle of Higher Education just had an article about Master Seminary not long ago with the kind of bullying culture. I think you have a very strong leader there who is convinced in his prophetic rightness, and in many cases he is right.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that he needs to be made into a kind of next to God sort of leader. So again, it's an idolatry problem, right? Whenever something other than the gospel becomes the thing you're seeking.
Well, in some church circles, we know that the pastor's put up on a pedestal. And if the pastor is also the leader of the institution, then it can be easy for the institution to put that president pastor up on a pedestal and not hold him accountable.
Absolutely. And a lack of accountability, I'd say, is at the heart of pretty much any of these scandals we could look at recently. Moody's another example. If you want to go Google that, it's high good fun reading. Not really. Yeah, I mean, whenever you have a figure, a program, a one piece of the university that's always right and that always gets its way, it's ceasing to function like a university.
Right.
A university is, by definition, a kind of multiplicity of voices talking to each other, seeking truth together, and through dialogue getting to a better place.
Well, and what I find interesting with like the Masters University and Seminary example is that there are these accusations, and we see that at other institutions as well, where boards of trustees are being manipulated in order to keep that presidential figure in power.
Right. Yes.
So,
I think that's right. And I'd say it's probably a little more complicated than simply unidirectional manipulation.
Right.
I think there's probably a manipulation going more than one way, right? You know, perhaps figures on the board agree to help somebody stay in power in order to receive some sort of side benefit from that. And it doesn't have to be something as disgusting as money, but maybe it's influence. Maybe it's feeling close to something they believe in.
right.
In any case, it takes some courage and it takes some humility to stand up when you see something that's not right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I feel compelled to say once again that, you know, we're bringing up some examples and we're putting Christian higher education in the vice tonight a little bit, as it were, but there are a lot of schools out there that are doing such great work. And I'll name one, Southern Wesleyan University.
Doing good work.
It is a university that I've had some experience with in the recent past, where it was amazing. They are following their values. Mm-hmm. They set goals based on the principles of faith and their commitments theologically, mm-hmm. and they follow through with those. They care about the students and their progress in faith, and so.
I was actually on an accreditation team at Southern Wesleyan
a
great number of years ago, but I remember at the time, I mean, they didn't have a whole lot in the way of resources. I think that's improving a little bit, but at the time, it was a simple little school, but they had good people who were working really hard, who loved the students, and who knew what they were about.
Yeah.
I'll give a shout out to Columbia International University.
Okay.
They're actually a school that has a very strong charismatic leader, but they haven't turned him into an idol because the mission matters more than the people, than the individual personalities. Let me put it that way. So it's a good thing.
Okay, so maybe that segues into our second question, the genesis of culture, I call it. Why do these types of cultures exist? Because if you've got Christian men and women that are purportedly following the Lord Jesus Christ in all that they do, then we would think that things should be great at these universities, that it should be apparent that they're following, but in so many cases, the dysfunctions still exist. So what's going on? Why?
We would think, right?
We would think.
So I have a whole bunch of answers to that question.
Oh, okay, good.
But the first one, I'll go to the kind of mechanistic, structural answer first, which is that oftentimes Christian institutions are set up very differently than their secular counterparts, which is to say they don't have tenure. They don't have strong faculty governance. And I am well aware of the dangers of giving someone a job for life. There are major dangers that can be associated with that. On the other hand, I would also say if someone's been through a PhD program, if they've been through a probably 7-year job training program, they can probably be trusted. They probably won't go off the deep end. So the fact that people often don't feel safe speaking their mind because they know they could lose their job very quickly. And the higher ed market is hard. It's a very, very hard place to get a job. So I think that's part of it. And, in the absence of love, there's fear. And in the presence of fear, there's an absence of love, right? And it's hard to run an institution when people don't trust each other.
Sure.
So that's one answer. I remember in an undergrad class, this is my second answer. It's amazing how you have those memories from way back when, isn't it? Our professor asked us to define culture. And I thought, that is the hardest question. Mm-hmm. How do you define culture? But we talked about it for a while. And what we finally came up with is that culture is the stuff you don't think about. And I think that makes sense, right? We grow up in our families and they have certain cultures that you have weird things that your family does. And you don't know they're weird until you hang out with another family. We grow up in churches and they have weird things that they do, or maybe they have wonderful things that they do. And you don't realize how weird or wonderful those things are till you go somewhere else, right? I think part of what happens in Christian higher education is that you reproduce your weirdness. Because we're all from the same, at least many of us are from the same sort of often quite conservative, evangelical or fundamentalist culture. Mm-hmm. And we just keep reproducing and upping the ante on the same authority structures that sometimes go awry in churches. And we don't think about it. And in fact, I think that's very dangerous at the higher ed level because we're trained to think. And we're actively shutting that down in many cases.
Right.
So, for example, I can remember teaching to my undergraduates Milton's Areopagitica, which is a great, great, great defense of free speech from a Christian perspective. And the main argument is open up the marketplace of ideas, open up free thought, open up free inquiry, because if you really believe that truth is stronger, it's going to win. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to be afraid of. And I remember having this conversation with a classroom full of Christian students. And then someone said, but I'm afraid that I'll be contaminated by certain things. And then, I thought back and it's like, that's like elementary school, Sunday school thinking. That's not higher ed thinking. Yeah. But we were reproducing it.
Right.
Again. So we end up in a kind of logical contradiction.
It is interesting. That's a great point. I mean, we do reproduce our own weirdness.
Yeah.
I agree. And it is a Sunday school kind of mentality. I never thought about it like that, but we start to live our lives out in higher education in the same myopic way that we live sometimes in our church environments, when higher education is supposed to be critical thought, open thought.
Right.
Yeah.
And we should all be big enough kids not to take it personally when someone disagrees with our idea in a meeting, right?
Right, absolutely. So the genesis of culture. So we've got this culture. We have it. I mean, we can't do anything about it. It's here.
It's here.
It's a reality. What do we do to correct it? How do we improve higher education?
Yeah.
And that's the question. That's really what we drive at on this show is it's easy to point and make the accusations. Here's a problem, but how do we fix it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think one piece, and I'm going to go to a mechanistic structural place again, is that we should hire a diversity of graduates from a diversity of schools. If what we're worried about is reproducing ourselves, then the quickest way to avoid that is not to only have ourselves around us, right? So introduce some diversity, and I don't mean bring in people with widely differing worldviews. I think Christian education runs the gamut. And in some cases, worldview definitions are very, very narrow, and that's okay.
Right.
Certain schools can choose to do it that way. Certain other schools could say, we have a little more flexibility. Both are viable models.
Right.
What you don't want is to only bring in people who are already like you, though.
Right.
Not only does that suggest a real lack of humility, but it makes the sort of dialogue that you would want to have impossible because there's nobody else to talk to. So I'd say that's a structural answer. Another structural answer would be to think about, what can we do on these campuses to encourage free inquiry in safe ways? Okay, not necessarily in ways where you maybe don't want, if you're on a conservative campus, the Arminians and the Calvinists to have an open debate. You're going to end up with like bearded people running around in a circle, and the hippies
Right.
objecting to that, right? You don't want to do that, right? It's too loaded. But at the same time, I think we can debate all kinds of interesting things. For instance, we could debate immigration policies. That's very much in the news right now. Conservatives and liberals differ. Different faith traditions differ. There is no uniformity for the most part. So why can we not have a dialogue about that?
Right.
And I think let's model it. Let's practice it in ways where nobody's going to lose their job. Nobody's going to get a bad grade. And then that makes everyone feel a little bit safer when they're treated with respect.
Well, and you mentioned this earlier in the last question. You're kind of alluding to it in an indirect way here. There's this hyper loyalty culture in a lot of these schools. If you show any kind of dissent or what would be perceived as disloyalty, then suddenly you're gone. We've got to get rid of you.
Right.
But there is a benefit to opening up that dialogue and saying, you disagree with me, but let's talk through this. Let's figure out, even if I disagree with you as a leader, I disagree with what you're coming to me with, the dissent you're coming. Let me talk with you through it, because maybe there are some nuggets in there that we can use. And maybe if we work together in Christ's likeness, we can come up with even better solution to the problem, the issue, the matter that we're trying to solve.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I mean, that's the body of Christ working like
Exactly,
the body, right? I will say I think, and we all know this in our gut, right? There's a difference between respectful, productive, constructive dissent and trying to sink the ship.
Right.
And I think most of the dissent that I've seen on Christian campuses, and I've visited quite a few, has been respectful. Occasionally someone has reached a frustration or an anger point, and then it starts to seem a little less that way, but they've been driven there, usually by being shut down over and over and over again.
Sure.
What I have seen, however, in some cases is dismantling the structures in which productive dissent can happen. A classic place for this on most university campuses would be faculty meetings, where you have a kind of open dialogue, and you may present something 2 or 3 times for lengthy dialogue, often for electronic commentary, things like that, before you get to a vote.
Right.
And you may decide it's too early to vote. Now, the geological time that unfolds in can be frustrating if you need to get something done.
Sure.
But it really does give people a chance to talk. It gives ideas a chance to simmer. And then usually if an idea has simmered for a while and it still seems like a good idea, it's a good idea.
Right.
And then from my perspective as a administrator, it always takes a certain amount of time to get an idea in the marketplace, right? And you can pay for it on the front end or you can pay for it on the back end. So I would rather everyone dialogue for a while than make a decision and then implement quickly, than implement too fast and then not know what they're doing.
You told me something one time in a meeting when we were working together years ago. You said you've got to let faculty have their voice or you'll steal their soul.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
You've told me I said this before, and I have no recollection of it, but I believe you. So.
But I think there's so much, faculty members, academics, they have views. They have strong views. They want to be heard on those views. And giving them a forum to do that is very, very important. And when you don't, it has a negative morale effects.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they deserve to be heard.
Right.
I think sometimes... we forget how much faculty members went through to get where they are. But I remember when I did my graduate training, I got to my dissertation defense. And at that point, you're going to pass because they don't let you get there if you're not going to. So I was kind of relaxed and I was happy. And maybe about 10 minutes into the defense, my chair and my first reader started fighting with each other. And that was great for me because I didn't have to talk. But at the same time, I thought, when am I ever going to get 2 leading scholars having a fight about my work? What a blessing on a Christian college campus to have great minds with great training, fighting through some issues that really, really matter.
Right.
So we don't want to shut that down.
No, we don't. Absolutely not. So as kind of a final thought and wrap up, if you hypothetically had an opportunity to sit down with a college, maybe a newly appointed college president at a Christian institution, or maybe one of the presidents that's going through a period of dysfunction right now, what are the top 3 pieces of advice you would give that person?
Yeah, those are That's hard, right? Because 3 is such a biblical number.
It is. That's why I picked it.
It's such a biblical number. I'm glad it's not 7. Okay, so I'd say the first thing is something I alluded to earlier, which was the body of Christ, right?
Right.
Remember that we're working like a body. And I think that has a lot of components. I mean, one component to it is that we need each other, and that means we need to be humble, right? Especially the leader needs to be humble, because the leader, the brain, whatever you want to say, can't get a thing done without everything else helping them. It also means, though, you got to know what everybody else's skill sets are. My team now, we have a woman on it who's an amazing detail thinker, just amazing. It would drive me crazy to be her. Her brain is just in these kind of organizational moments. She never forgets anything. But I mean, how great for me to have her on my team. I mean, I'm more of a vision person. I like to take things to implementation, but I rely on Laura, bless Laura, to tell me when I'm going to screw up. Or if I'm missing a policy or something like that. And I would think that a president at a university would need to know his team or her team. And that takes time. It takes a lot of lunches or a lot of meetings. It takes not reproducing the power structure as it exists, but actually talking to people and listening to people. So that's the first thing. Remember, we're a body.
Right.
I'd say the second is, and again, I alluded to this, listen. And I don't mean just sit down with somebody and hear them when they talk to you, though I do mean that. I also mean leave the structures in place where listening happens. Right. And if they're not in place, make more of them. And make it safe for people to talk in respectful, productive ways. And facilitate ways for people to talk outside their departments. Facilitate ways for faculty to talk to students. For student affairs to talk to academic affairs, right? Because the clubs and org people have a lot to say to the academics and vice versa. So make sure everyone talks and is heard. And listen to it.
Right. And I think that's so important. And often you hit on something that's near and dear to my heart. A lot of times we forget to listen to the students. In this whole equation of higher education, we often talk about administrators and faculty. But obviously, the students are a major, central part of this equation.
Absolutely.
But how many times do we hear universities administrators say, hey, let's go see what the students have to say about this? And I agree. Having those forums where the students have input into what strategic decisions are being made at the university level.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And you don't have to necessarily treat the students like customers who get to decide everything. I think that's unhealthy. No. But if they say, nobody told me about having to file my FAFSA for my financial aid, well, they were probably told 5 or 6 times. Right. But for whatever reason, they didn't get the message. Right. So, what they're saying is that we didn't communicate appropriately. Right? So how do we do that? Right. I'd say the last thing, and it's going to sound really, really boring and really simple, but it's, have a vision, have a mission, and stick to it. And I don't think you can over-communicate a mission. I don't think you can over-communicate a vision. And I think that it's going to mean different things to different people, and that's a healthy thing. That's a good thing, and we can all bring different components to it. Right. But if you read university mission statements, and sometimes I do this for fun, they kind of blur into one another after a while. A lot of them right now in the secular sphere are about things like civic engagement or making a difference in your community, things like that. Christian colleges' mission statements tend to be kind of evangelistic in nature. Right. Not always, but often. The ones that seem to really kind of set the universities off on a good course are ones that have a kind of point to them, a kind of specificity. So I'm going to go back again to Columbia International. They're evangelical in nature, they're missional in nature, but they mean international missions. Right. And that's what they're training for. So whenever somebody says, hey, we want to start a new program, the question is, how will this support or supplement what we're doing for international missions? Right. Because that's our calling. Yep. That's why we were founded. So. Yeah,
and what can you say? I mean, vision is obviously so important. There's always a vision. Even when a leader doesn't give a vision, that leaves a vision. And that vision may be blindness, and people wander in blindness. And we've seen that in institutions where there is no vision and everybody's just kind of trying to make their own way, doing what they think is right. Yep. And oftentimes it leads can lead down some ethical and moral paths that folks don't really want to go down, but they find themselves on these paths because
Absolutely.
of a lack of goal-driven vision.
Absolutely. And the president, along with key leaders on the campus, is the chief interpreter and communicator of the vision.
Absolutely.
And, that's going to be personalized and tailored to how the president sees it. So I'd say be in prayer about that.
Right.
Listen to the wisdom of those around, and then go to the way that seems best.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm on a campus now where we have a mission focused on citizen leadership, and I think my campus is doing a good job with it. They care about helping professions. We have a president who's been there 5 or 6 years, and he's got some kind of different interpretations of what that means than some previous presidents, and he's had a hard row to hoe because of that. And I admire his courage. I admire his tenacity. He's a deep believer in liberal arts education, though, and it's hard to put civic engagement and liberal arts education together, but he's working at it. I mean, he's trying, he's fighting. And I look and, some days I think he must be really tired. And he probably is. But I'd say the same thing for any Christian college administrator who wants to do something with vision. It's a battle.
Yes.
But it's one that's worthwhile if you believe you're spirit-led in that battle.
Absolutely. It lays that foundation.
Yeah.
So are there any final thoughts or anything that you'd want to say to the viewers before we depart?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say right now, this isn't just Christian higher education, but higher education in general is really at an interesting spot. There's kind of in the media widespread discussion about whether a college is worth it in terms of the money, and I think those are fair questions. We have legislators who are often not terribly familiar with how higher education works, sort of making policies and things like that, which tend to want to, in a good-hearted way, help students who haven't had tremendous economic advantages or educational advantages get a leg up. Sometimes those policies work. Sometimes it ends up throwing those students into deeper water than they're ready for. There's also a lot of legislative focus on job training, on thinking of education as a sort of credentialing mechanism.
Right.
And I would say those of us who are interested in Christian higher education need to resist that. I'd say there's nothing wrong with job training. I'd say it's a good thing. Credentialing's a good thing. I went to high school with a guy who I never had a conversation with. I didn't think he was really worth my time to talk to, but when I was in graduate school, he put a new engine in my car. And he's got a fantastic career as an auto mechanic, and that's where he needs to be. That's his gifting, and that's a good thing, and I'm glad he landed there. But if all we think of is college as advanced job training, we're in a bad spot, right? To go back to the whole idea of the liberal arts, right? The whole idea of the liberal arts is one truth from many angles.
Right.
Okay, that's not job training.
Right.
Okay, and that certainly doesn't if you send a Christian out to work for SmithKline Beecham Pharmaceuticals. Let that person grow flexibly enough to move from one position to another position to another position.
Right.
So I'd say the place of Christian higher education moving forward is not to abandon job training, not to say it doesn't matter, but to honor it, but also to say our place is squarely in the liberal arts tradition.
Right. And not to train skills,
Exactly.
but to train up critical thinkers.
Correct. It's the difference between education and instruction, as Newman would say. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being with us this
Really
evening
enjoyed it.
on a cold, rainy, icy evening.
Yeah, it feels like Ohio out there.
And thank you all for being with us this evening, those who joined us live and those who will see the recorded version of this in a little while. We appreciate you all being here with us. Obviously, a topic of Christian higher education, we could probably go on for hours and hours talking about this. But the issue is that there are problems out there. There are misconceptions. There are cultures in some of these schools that need to be corrected. Things that if we want to be the followers of Jesus Christ, the best followers of Jesus Christ, would be to raise up the next generation of critical Christian thinkers that can make a difference in this world, both professionally and in their lives of faith, then we have to look critically at our institutions of Christian higher education and ask the question, what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? And how can we correct any deficiencies that are out there in these institutions? Folks, this is important. There's a lot at stake. There are a lot of young men and women that are in Christian schools all around our country and all around the world today. And some are getting wonderful, wonderful educations and in growing in their faith, and others not so much. And so what can we do to help as the church, our institutions of Christian higher education be all they can be? and to fulfill God's ideal. Well, again, thank you for joining us. I hope you'll be with us next week. We're going to be back at our regular day and time, Tuesday, February 26th, 8 p.m., right here on Clean Slate's Facebook page. We are going to be with Dr. Karen Swallow Pryor, and she's going to talk to us about Christianity and culture. So I hope you'll join us then, and we'll see you next Tuesday.